All right. Hello, everyone. This is My Two Cents. Welcome back to my channel. Today, I have a special guest. I am joined by Dr. Bo Bennett of logicallyfallacious.com. He is the author of a book by the same name. And as the front page of his website says, the book is a crash course meant to catapult you into a world where you start seeing things how they really are and not how you think they are. I have personally used his website, Logically Fallacious, many times when evaluating various arguments and comments of the utmost stupidity that appear on many of my videos. But anyways, Dr. Bennett, thank you for being on. I'll give you a quick moment to introduce yourself.
Well, thank you for having me. Yeah, my name is Bo Bennett, and I like to think of myself as a teacher of critical thinking. I do teach professionally, academically at LaSalle College, just part-time. What's called an adjunct professor, meaning that I teach like 1 or 2 classes a semester. Psychology based, and my classes, I get to design them. So I really focus on the critical thinking aspect, cognitive biases, logical fallacies, things like how the mind works and how things could go wrong. My basic goal with my classes is to let the students know that the mind is a lot more fallible than most people think it is, including memory, the way we see things, the way we perceive things. I mean, everything. And that's kind of the goal I want to get across. And I do the same thing on my websites. Logically Fallacious is just one of my many books and websites that all really have the central theme of critical thinking to get people to ask questions, the uncomfortable questions, which is one of my books as well, Uncomfortable Ideas, and just consider the answers. I think that's really important. Thinking, rational discussion, and just discussing all these issues and topics without falling into the logical traps and a lot of the traps of rhetoric that people often do, unfortunately. And that's what I'm all about.
Definitely. I think that's awesome. I'm always reminded whenever I talk about reasoning and how we know things, I always think of the story that's told about supposedly Socrates was approached by a student who told him he was the wisest man in the world. He said, how can that be? I don't really know anything. Well, his student pointed out, well, yeah, but there are a lot of other people who claim to know things. And when you look harder, you realize they really don't. And Socrates said, wow, I guess I must be the wisest man in the world. And in that, he was willing to admit he didn't actually know everything.
Right. He knows one more thing than everybody else. And that thing is that he doesn't know anything.
Indeed. And I will say, as someone who is very politically in a lot of political economic discussions, there's no shortage of people who think they have all the answers. And it's I've always said there's no one harder to have a discussion with than someone who believes he knows everything.
Right.
Anyway, so to start things off, obviously you talked about you're really into the mind, critical thinking, that kind of stuff. As far as Logically Fallacious, that website, is there anything that really inspired you to start talking about logical fallacies, such that you wrote that book specifically or started that website?
Yes, certainly. It was about maybe 10 years ago. I was approached by a good friend of mine that also I used to work with, and he wanted to introduce me to Jesus. I was raised Catholic. I went to I did all the confirmation, all the sacraments, but I never really, after I got communion in 8th grade, I never really went to church besides like weddings and funerals and stuff. Never thought much about it. I considered myself a believer, like a Christian, but that was kind of it. But when it was really pushed on me, I said, all right, this is probably something I should actually look at. And I spent at the time too. I sold my company a while ago, my first big company. So I was kind of financially set, so I could really devote full time to pretty much anything I wanted. So I devoted about 3 years to looking at religion, mostly Christianity, but also other religions, other world religions. And I started a website called debategod.com, where I collected debates, and I had like over 1,000 hours of debates on there from people dating back from like the 80s. The debates went that far back on religion. And it was just like a really interesting process listening to these debates and analyzing them. And this was before psychology too. This is before I was really into psychology and before I got my PhD. So it was the process of saying, okay, well, wait, how could two people seem to be so right. They're both so confident that they're right, yet they're arguing completely different sides. And I was fascinated by that. So I turned the Debate God site also into a forum, an online forum where I had believers come together with non-believers. And at that point, I was like, I am right in the middle. Let me just sit in the middle. Let me argue both sides and really ask questions and see where this thing takes me. And after about 3 years of doing that and running the site, I made my way over to the atheist side, and then I started kind of like as an angry atheist. And you hear that story a lot when people first become atheists. They're angry. It's like, holy crap, I was screwed this whole time. I was misled, and all these people that misled me, and all this stuff that I bought, and you're just like mad at everybody. And I didn't like that feeling, but I rode that angry atheist high for about 6 months, and then that went down, and I started to understand things a lot better. And I was so sick of the debate. But in all that time when I was debating personally and I was listening to the debates, I started to realize all these things that people are saying that sounds good, but they make no sense whatsoever. Like, if you think about them logically, it has no direct connection to the argument. And so I started to look things up, and I'm like, oh, that's called a logical fallacy. Okay. And then I looked some more up, and I was going all over the internet, like scouring the internet, finding, and there was no like central depository for all these fallacies. So I figured, these are fascinating to me. I absolutely love learning about this. So why don't I put something together and create this one place with the collection of all the fallacies, or as many as I could find. And that's how Logically Fallacious began. That's kind of the history of it, and that's what kicked me off.
All right, awesome. Since you brought it up, I will say, when it comes to discussions, there's probably no discussion that gets people angrier than religious discussions. And obviously, people on both sides of that issue. I've always said, you've got your very hardcore evangelicals waving Bibles, screaming, repent or you're going to hell. But then on the opposite side, you have the angry atheists who are out to explain to every religious person out there just how stupid they are. But I think if they took the time to step back from it, they'd realize they sound just as dogmatic as the fundamentalist believers they're supposedly condemning. But yeah, I too, I don't talk about religious issues a lot on my channel, but in my personal time, I do very much enjoy those kinds of debates. And there's definitely a difference between a debate with someone. I don't know if you're familiar with someone. I'm going to give two individuals. If you've been involved in religious debate, you've probably heard of them. On one hand, you've got people like Cy Ten Bruggencate, who you watch his debates and just want to facepalm. On the other hand, people like William Lane Craig, who, even if you disagree with him, I think you would agree he lays out his case in a far more rational, respectful manner. Moving on then, I will say, when it comes to logical fallacies, when I'm talking to a lot of people, most people know what a fallacy, like what the word fallacy is. But when you start talking about specific logical fallacies, very few people actually know what many of them are. And I think back to my own education, kindergarten through 12th grade, I don't recall ever actually having a class in logic or reasoning or fallacies. I mean, obviously there were concepts that were touched on, but more or less, it was really just kind of, teachers told you what you were supposed to think. This is what the experts believe. And you didn't talk a lot about how people reason to their conclusions. So, I have found most people don't. Is that something, would you say that matches your experience, or that most people don't?
I'm not sure if I would say most people, and I think it's difficult to dichotomize this issue and say, like, you either reason or you don't. I think everybody reasons, but some to a better degree than others. Mm-hmm. So the reasoning would be on a spectrum where some people are really good at it and some people are lousy at it. I would say that most people are certainly in the middle. So I would agree that most people definitely are not very good at it. Yeah, that's my view on on where people generally stand when it comes to reason. And as you mentioned, in school, people are taught what to think and not how to think. And I think that's a major issue that really should be changed. I think classes like philosophy, logic, reasoning. I think there should be classes on these. But an interesting thing in psychology is there it has been shown, like through a lot of research and studies, that it's very difficult to directly teach critical thinking without applying it to like other courses. I guess, in other words, a better way to put this is they found when critical thinking is mixed into a regular curriculum, like in history and science and like everything, that's when people really learn critical thinking and learn it best, as opposed to having like a class specifically in critical thinking. It seems, I don't know the exact reason for it, but if I were to guess, I would say that it probably goes over a lot of people's heads. And when you have nothing to directly connect it to, it becomes like meaningless for you. But when you're learning critical thinking in a course, especially a course that you like, with a topic that you like, then it becomes interesting, and you tend to remember these things. Myself, as an example, again, it came to down to religion and these religious debates. I wanted to know what is more true, or which argument I could say, okay, that's a bad argument, this is a good argument, in order to try to get a little bit closer to the truth. And the way to do that was through understanding critical thinking, reason, and logical fallacies. So I had a direct reason to actually learn this and really care about it. And that's kind of what connected me to logical fallacies.
Oh, absolutely. And what you said at the end there, I think one thing I've always noticed to kind of tell the difference between someone who understands a subject and someone who thinks he understands a subject is to ask, regardless of what position they're taking, if it's a religious debate, as you said, whether they're taking a atheist position or a theistic position, if you can ask someone, can you describe for me a good argument and a bad argument for the side with which you disagree with? And if they can do that, they probably have studied it. They probably understand it in a lot more of a rational fashion. If I say, can you give me a good argument for the side that you disagree with? And they say, of course not. There's no good reason anyone would ever believe in that.
Yeah.
They're all horrible arguments. Odds are they probably don't understand the issue quite as well as they think.
Right. I always tell my wife that I'd be a horrible politician, because I find it extremely difficult to be so passionate about an issue where you see people kind of like falling to the politicians, where people out there screaming and at the podium and raising their hand and saying, we need this, and this is wrong and this is right. I really tend to see both sides of arguments and say, yeah, well, there's a lot of good points on that side and there's a lot of good points on this side. Of course, there are some issues where it's like it's very, very difficult to see. Okay, yeah, like white nationalism, that makes sense. Some things are very, very difficult. But if you could sympathize with people and you could understand, again, this is where psychology comes in. If you could understand where they come from, how they were brought up, what they believe in, what they were told, kind of like the educational bubble that they might have been in, or the societal bubble where they don't have a lot of influence from outside people, you could start to at least sympathize. And I don't. Sometimes that might sound wrong, like you have sympathy for somebody, but when you sympathize and empathize with somebody, you could kind of put yourself in their shoes, and you could say, all right, I could see why you think this, and I could now understand why you think this. So at the very least, your hatred for other people or people's ideas, your disgust, that starts to really disappear when you take that step and try to understand somebody, as opposed to just write them off as evil people or just stupid people or any other derogatory term that really just dismisses every point that they might have. Whether some points, even though most of the points are lousy, some of them still might be valid points, and that should be something that you should take into consideration.
Definitely. And when it comes to the kind of mob mentality that I think unfortunately tends to rise up in many different ideological circles, as soon as someone is convinced that they are 100% right and anyone who disagrees with them, well, the only possible reason, they must be evil, outright wicked. As soon as someone becomes convinced of that, you cannot have a meaningful conversation with that person. It's just anything you say will go right over their head. They're not really interested in considering other viewpoints. They're interested in telling you, they can scream their opinions so they're blue in the face, but they wouldn't even begin to be able to interact with the actual points of the other side.
Right. It comes down to like dehumanizing people and just putting them in that corner of non-human. and therefore, you don't have to treat them the same way. You could completely detach yourself emotionally to them as like fellow human beings if you see them as less than human, and it's sad how many people do that today.
Hmm. Uh, just as an aside to those, I see we have 13 people watching at the moment. If you do have any questions for Dr. Bennett, go ahead and post those in the chats. I will probably not get to them until I get through the rest of the things I had planned to discuss, but near the end, I will start asking some of those questions. So go ahead and post them. Anyways, my next question for you is, what do you think is the most important reason, if you were talking to someone and they said, I don't think it's important, I don't need to understand reason, logical fallacies, any of that, it's just it has no practical application to my life, what would you say to such a person?
I would ask them how they know what's true and let them try to explain it to me. And I've done this in the past when people say, "Yeah, science, that's a bunch of crap," and they'll point out some of the flaws with science, or how like our brains are imperfect for reasoning, or some people may even say that Satan has a hold of us, so that's why we can't reason correctly. Whatever. The point is, like, okay, whatever you say about reason, critical thinking, and science, give me a better alternative and explain to me how you could know something and come closer to the truth without using that. And immediately that question just disqualifies what they're saying, because as soon as they start to say something, they're rational, they're reasoning, and they're explaining. So they're using reason, they're just not using it correctly. And that's really the point I try to get across. And after they say something, I tell them that. I say, you know what? Believe it or not, you're using reason to tell me all this. You're just using it incorrectly. And once you start to realize that, you'll understand, yeah, I should probably be using reason correctly versus incorrectly. Therefore, I'll get closer to the truth on anything. And I try to give them some like benefits. How could somebody's life be better if they know how to reason well? Well, for one thing, you won't get scammed nearly as often. As we all know, the internet is filled with scammers. The world is full of scammers. People always trying to take advantage of you. But when you understand critical thinking and reason, and people like to play on superstitions, they like to play on your insecurities. People like to sell, snake oils and try to get you, if you're not feeling well or whatever, try to get you to buy their crap. But if you really understand the scientific process, the scientific method, if you understand the reasoning process, critical thinking, you can avoid those pitfalls. So there's one way you could save money, or you could make money by improving your reasoning skills.
Oh, definitely. I always laugh when people say that sort of thing. You can't use logic, you can't use arguments to discover the truth. And then you say, "Oh yeah, why not?" And of course, as you said, they proceed to give an argument why you don't use arguments, and therefore and the whole process is self-defeating then.
Right. And then people obviously they bring up the metaphysical a lot, and it's like, oh, there's things that we can't know, we can't possibly know, and they try to interject the mystery card, whether it be the universe, whether it be some a whole series of gods, or the god, or it doesn't matter. The point is, they try to introduce magic and mystery into the world in order to invalidate your reason, science, and logic. And it just doesn't work. And time after time again, you could show somebody that it doesn't work, especially when you compare their ideas. Like, okay, well, what do you know through this magic, or through your instinct and your gut feeling? And they may say something like, I know for certain that this leader is the best leader that there is, and he was appointed by God, or whatever. And then you say, well, what do you say to somebody else who says the other leader is the best leader in the world, and they just know it from the bottom of their heart and intuition, and this leader was appointed by God? What do you say to them, and how do you resolve it? And once they kind of get that, they're like, okay, yeah, well, I just know I'm right. And they realize that, oh yeah, the other person's probably saying that same thing. So we need a tool. We need something that we both have in common in order to figure this out. Instead of just saying that, both declaring that we're both right, and stomping our feet and plugging our ears. And that tool is reason, logic, critical thinking, science. the toolbox, the series of tools. And I think people either they do get it at some level, they're not very good at it. So when you're not good at something, you tend to dismiss it and go for something that's a lot easier. And of course, that lot easier thing is, well, I just know.
And they appeal to their personal experience, which, to be fair, we all appeal to our personal experience at some level to know whether or not something's true. But then, as you point out, you run into the problem. Well, then the moment somebody else has a personal experience that doesn't match your own, I can't make someone else share this personal experience I've had, or explain why my experience is more valid. And if you don't have common ground from which you both agree, okay, we can at least agree that this is how we go about discovering truth. Now let's see who's really has the facts on their side. Then
Right.
it just reduces to shouting at each other. I'm right. No, I'm right. No, I'm right. No, I'm right. Now there are a few extra words in there, but really that's all that's going on.
Right.
All right. That being said, what would you say are probably some of the most I know on the front of your website you have the 25 most common fallacies listed there, but what would you say are perhaps for those watching some of the most common fallacies you see that are the most harmful, perhaps the most harmful to reasoning, but usually go undetected?
Well, one of the first ones, if anybody's new to logic, new to reasoning or logical fallacies in general, I think an important one to understand is the non sequitur. And the reason I say that is because that is kind of like the base of every informal logical fallacy. It basically means that what you're saying does not follow. And if you just pick like a logical fallacy at random, let's say like the ad hominem, when you say like this person is wrong because he's an idiot, well, you could argue, well, that could follow, but let's say that somebody's saying that the school budget should be increased by $1,000 a month, and they give an argument for it, and then somebody else says, well, you know what, that guy is a moron, so we shouldn't listen to him. Well, that's a clear ad hominem, because the person isn't addressing the argument; they're making a personal attack at the person's character, and that character in this situation has no bearing on the argument itself, whether the argument, what he's saying, is true or valid or sound. So basically, we're saying that doesn't follow. It doesn't follow that because person X is a moron, that his argument is incorrect.
Yes. It could be the case you're wrong, therefore an idiot, but it can't be the case you're an idiot, therefore you're wrong.
Therefore you're wrong. It could be. And that's why one of the great things about informal fallacies, and the fun thing about them, I wouldn't say it's a great thing. It would be a lot better if it were crystal clear every time what was a logical fallacy. But each informal fallacy is like an argument in itself. So I could say, in this case, I could say that's an ad hominem, that's a fallacy. And then somebody else could say, well, no, it's not. And here's why. So it becomes an argument. People argue their side as to why something's a fallacy or not. And it pertains to informal fallacies, as opposed to like deductive logical fallacies, where it's definitely the case that if this is, like the whole Socrates is mortal fallacy.
All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Yes.
Yeah. Or you mix it up and you make the fallacy. But the point is, like, the deductive logical fallacies, they are like definitely fallacious, and they're problems with the form of the argument as opposed to the particulars that one needs to know about the argument in order to call a logical fallacy.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Anyways, I'm gonna talk about a few here that I feel like I encounter quite often in discussions I'm having and comments on my YouTube videos. And you obviously brought up the ad hominem probably is the most used fallacy out there, and it seems to be most people, if you disagree with someone, unfortunately, most people turn immediately to a character assassination, which,
Right.
even if true, it could be that person A making argument X is a horrible person, but that doesn't mean his argument itself is wrong.
Right.
That doesn't pertain to, but I guess what makes me kind of sad is I see that it works in political campaigns. I think most people in those kind of positions understand the fallacy, but they also understand, if I can make my political opponent look like a horrible person, people might, even if my ideas, even if I have no idea what I'm doing, people will still vote for me as vice, not vote for the horrible person. So,
Right, right. Yeah,
um,
that's actually an important distinction that's probably worth mentioning. Is when you look at a logical fallacy, there's actually two parts to it in a way. One can be like a deliberate. Somebody could be saying something deliberately in order to, like, as a form of rhetoric, in order to win the audience. A good example of that is the argument by gibberish. When you just say like a bunch of nonsense, highly technical words to make people think you know what you're talking about. Now, the question is, who committed the logical fallacy there? Was it the person who said all that gibberish in order to try to deceive the audience or the other people, or was it the audience actually listening and taking that as something legitimate and then giving that speaker credibility because of that? My stance and what I say in the website is it's about flaws in reasoning. So the people who are listening to that, they're the ones that are guilty of the fallacy. The person who actually is committing that or is using the argument by gibberish, they don't have a problem with their reasoning. They may have a problem with their morals and their ethics, but not necessarily with the reasoning. So I try to shy away from calling a fallacy on that. So like you mentioned the ad hominem, that's another one. People could say, like politicians say it all the time. Well, this person is an idiot. This person's a moron, and just start listing a whole bunch of garbage about them to distract people from the good arguments or the policies that they're making, and it works. I mean, people generally they're not that smart when it comes to logic and reason. They're on that spectrum and they're closer to the middle or even on the lower end. They're definitely not well versed in logic and reasoning, so they don't understand this, and they see that as a good argument. So in their minds, the person who's like getting all the laughter and the applause, they're winning, and it shouldn't be that way, but unfortunately it is.
mm-hmm.
It reminds me of that scene on Idiocracy, the courtroom scene with the judge. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, but it's a classic, especially when it comes to reasoning and seeing, the dystopian future where people aren't really educated in critical thinking or educated at all, for that matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Another one that I encounter quite frequently is, I guess that I'm not sure if you would call this a fallacy per se, but there are often a lot of fallacies attached to it, and that's when somebody constructs their viewpoint such that it's fundamentally unfalsifiable. For example, I deal with debating economics quite a bit, and I've got a lot of people of the Marxist persuasion that would disagree with my views on that, and I've always found it to be, I believe, one of the best examples of unfalsifiability. And Karl Popper himself, who talked about falsifiability, pointed out that when Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, he made specific predictions that he said we're going to have in wealthy countries. The rich would become richer, the poor would become poorer, and inevitably the poor would revolt, and it would lead to this utopian communist state. Well, over the next 150 years, things didn't happen. And Popper said, well, on that view, then Marxism should, based on Marx's predictions not coming true, you ought to conclude that his view was false. But instead, Marxists basically take the view and come up with ad hoc theories that insulate it from that, such that no observation could possibly falsify the viewpoint. And that's just one example, but a lot of people, I in my view, I think they start with their conclusions and then they express them in such a way that no amount of evidence could possibly overturn them.
Right. I don't want to, well, I'll bring it up because it's interesting,
Okay.
and related to your point. I got into like a little mini Facebook debate. I joined on a thread where my cousin posted, "I'm so sick of people saying #blessed," and like, "Oh, I got a new diamond ring, #blessed. Oh, I got to go on vacation, in the wherever in the Bahamas, #blessed." And she was just kind of like venting how pissed she is at seeing the blessed. So it was an interesting discussion getting in, like, what does that mean exactly, blessed? Are you saying that God is giving you special favor? And the argument, it ended up unraveling to the point where exactly what you say, like, well, you could look all around and you could see that Bible believing Christians die at the same rate, get divorced at the same rate, have cancer at the same rate, lose, like everything is the same rate. There's no special privilege, whether you're a Christian, whether you're Islam, whether like any religion, these shitty things happen to everybody. Pretty much equally, and a lot of it's based on finances and where you are, the wealth in the world. But for the most part, all things being equal, when it comes to beliefs and religion, like this whole idea of being blessed is just it's special pleading. And a lot of people were jumping on, well, and after they kind of got to the point where, okay, I guess I can't acknowledge that I have more than other people. But in the next life, that's what, and of course you just got to an unfalsifiable position. I mean, what are you supposed to say there? You can't say, well, we don't have access to that next life. So they just made an unfalsifiable argument, and now the conversation is dead.
Absolutely. And well, on the subject of blessed, I also think of quite frequently those same people, so if something good happens, it's because God blessed them. If something bad happens, it's because the devil or something else.
Right.
Now, I think principally there could be you could in fact make an argument that there's evidence in a particular case that this is blessing from God. That may or may not be good evidence, but in principle you could make such an argument. But when they basically say if something good happens, it's God's blessing. If something bad happens, it's Satan's curse. Well, then that could apply to any and all scenarios. So there's no way it seems you could ever test such a thing.
And then, of course, when you talk about, well, what about the Holocaust? That was a horrible thing. And then some people say, well, it could be a good thing. It could be good for humanity. I mean, it was a bad event, but in the long run, it could be good. So these are unfalsifiable things that they bring up in order to rescue, like ad hoc explanation, in order to rescue the initial idea that, whatever the idea that they have. So you could play with things. You could play with like the future. You could introduce like other lives or an afterlife. It's a whole idea of karma, getting off like Christianity specifically. The whole idea of karma is that the reason that you're suffering in this life is because you were a crappy person in the last life, or something like that, or the reason that you have good things happening to you because you were a good dog in the other life. But when you bring up these unfalsifiable positions, you get out of the realm of rational discourse and debate. And you just have to kind of throw in the towel and say, we can't go anywhere from here.
In principle, it could be true, but if so, you could never know it.
Yeah, I mean, it can't be. You don't know if it could be true or false. Mm-hmm. It's one of those things. So yeah, you don't know anything about it. It's unknowable.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, another one, and I'm going to use Marxism again just because that's what I deal with, but No True Scotsman. I actually made a video early on in my YouTube career called the No True Marxist Fallacy because I thought this is one that comes up a lot. But for example, if you're discussing a particular ideology and I say, well, what about if you think Marxism is in fact, the way society really ought to be, what do you make of the Soviet Union, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, all these countries that have attempted to implement Marxism, and
they weren't true Marxists, though.
Yeah, exactly. Their response then is those weren't real Marxist countries. Right. True Marxism has never been tried.
Right.
Well, but then of course I actually think there was actually an interview on Fox Business where Dr. Richard Wolff, who's one of the leading proponents of Marxist economics today, was asked, what country in the world right now is closest to your Marxist utopia? And he said, well, none of them are. And I said, well, quite literally, then there are no true Marxists. But yeah, the same thing where after a person's viewpoint is basically shown, the evidence doesn't match their view. Well, the case you're looking at was never true socialism, true Marxism, or what have you to begin with.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, it's very common.
And then, of course, you already brought it up once, but special pleading, same thing. The rules apply to everyone but me. And especially, I'm going to, like I said, I deal mostly with economics. So the examples that come to mind are, a person might say, well, the rich have an obligation to give up all their wealth and give a very large portion of their wealth to the poor. When you point out that person's driving a sports car, has a very nice house, and ask why, well, why haven't you given up? At least you clearly are well off at least compared to the rest of the world, why don't you give up some of your stuff? Well, I don't have to because I'm not as rich as, Jeff Bezos or whoever it may be. But they're perfectly willing to advocate for other people to give up their money to help the poor. But then when you ask them why they don't do the same, for some reason, it doesn't apply to them.
Yeah, sure. And that might even be a case of special pleading,
Mhm.
kind of putting yourself in a special category, even though that you fit the description of what you're actually arguing.
Okay. All right. Well, that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about. I'm going to look through the comments quick and see what anyone has put up here. Andrew Ryan would like to ask, what are your views on the book Thinking Fast and Slow?
Oh, I love that book. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. It's a really good book on cognitive psychology. It goes over it for just a quick introduction. Daniel Kahneman and Tversky, they actually was Kahneman that was awarded the Nobel Prize in behavioral economics for a lot of these different heuristics is one of, like, availability heuristic. They mentioned a whole bunch of them, but they really added quite a bit to the field because prior to their research, most people thought that people behaved economically, meaning that you would make decisions whatever best for you. Let's say, like, you're into economics, like financially, people would make the right financial decisions. But what Kahneman and Tversky understood is that it just doesn't work that way. People's thinking is very flawed. And they identified many different logical fallacies. They identified many cognitive biases. They tested these, like in the lab, and they did research on these. So they really have good support, scientific and academic support for a lot of their, all of their theories and the biases that they put forward and the heuristics. But basically, in short, they show how people think and how their thinking is flawed. And we have two levels and two means of thinking: what they call fast thinking, which would be like the level one, which is more kind of like instinctual. If somebody says, quick, do you want this or do you want this? You make a quick decision. You don't give it a lot of thought, and that's the majority of the thinking we do. Whereas our level two thinking is more analytical rather than reactionary, and we have to kind of like dig in, and we have to like do the mental math, and we have to think about things. So what they call heuristics are basically mental shortcuts. This is what helps us through lives, and it's kind of a important point in their book that I think a lot of people miss. Is it's not about like heuristics are bad and level one thinking is bad. And we all have to be analytical all the time. We could not possibly function like that. It's just impossible. We're human beings. All the information that comes to us and that we have to deal with on a regular basis, the reason that we survive and the reason we're here is because of these heuristics, because of these mental shortcuts we could take. Now, the thing about a heuristic, it's right. Let's say, I'm throwing this number out there, but let's say like 90% of the time or 80% of the time, that fast thinking you do when you make these decisions, it's usually like, okay, that's pretty good. But if you want to get close to 100%, you need to step back and you got to work out the math and you really think about it. But we cannot do that for every single decision that we make. So we use heuristics, and it gets us through the life. But what's so important about that book is understanding these heuristics, understanding that they exist, understanding that this is the way our mind works. And once you understand that, you have a better grasp on yourself and your own thinking, and you could step back when you know that you have an important decision to face, and you really do need to analyze it and not just come up like with a reactionary answer.
Okay.
So I love the book.
All right. Awesome. Moving on, Zio Gold. I'm not sure if this is a question or if you're just saying it, but I guess Zio Gold says, I encounter the Texas sharpshooter fallacy when arguing with social justice warriors. I guess if that is a question, you want to talk about the Texas sharpshooter fallacy?
Sure, that it's a funny fallacy because the whole idea of it is hilarious when you think about going to see like some Western guy and he says, I could shoot the bullseye every single time. It's like, all right, let me see you do it. So he just shoots a barn door and like shoots all crazy all over. And then you say, what the heck's going on? And then he goes up to the barn and he starts drawing the bullseye. So all of his shots are right in the middle. And you're like, hey, obviously, that's not right. So the Texas sharpshooter fallacy is when people do the same thing. You look for the clusters, basically. You look for the gathering of information, and then you make an argument around it, as if that had some meaning initially, but you're kind of doing the whole process backwards. I would love to. I can't think of a social justice warrior example of that, but I'm interested in what that commenter had in mind, and I can.
Okay, well, Zeal Gold, if you want to talk about an example that comes up, I guess something that comes, I mean, the process is essentially someone starts with their conclusion, and then they look for the evidence that confirms it.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, and it may be the case that there's actually quite a bit more evidence that contradicts their view, but they've zeroed in on just the pieces that seem to confirm their viewpoint.
Right. Well, I could actually talk about an excerpt that I wrote in my book, Uncomfortable Ideas, when I talked about, I think I was talking about social justice in particular in this chapter. Anyway, I do just want to say that, in terms of social justice, it's like, how could you be against it? Everybody wants justice, but it's one of those definitions where you could skew that to the point where it becomes absurd. You could take a perfectly good idea, and feminism is one thing as well. The idea that on one end you have the idea that women should have equal rights as men. Well, I mean, who's against that? I'm sure there are some people against that. But then you could take it to extremes where, all sex is rape. Men are pigs and deserve to be killed. There are some really crazy extreme positions.
Perhaps recently, as we saw in the news, if a woman accuses a man of rape, then it happened, period, no matter what the evidence says.
Yeah, like bypassing the justice system, the way, innocent until proven guilty. But you could take any concept that makes sense and you could completely bastardize it to the extreme, and I think that's wrong. But that's kind of more of like maybe a philosophical issue, an ethical issue. But we also see this in social justice, the area of social justice, when people completely go against science and scientific methodology, and they know they're doing it, or at least I think they know they're doing it, but they don't care. It's more important the point that they're trying to make, or the ideology that they're trying to uphold, even though science may tear it down. One of the examples I wrote about that is sort of like the Texas sharpshooter fallacy is, let's say that you're trying to study racism and to see if black servers are treated, or what was it? The black customers are treated worse than white customers at a restaurant, right? So right. You would think, how would you study this? Well, if you want to see like racism, if you define racism as something against, like something that only white people could commit, like that's actually a very popular argument now, that people of color or anybody oppressed or any kind of minority can't be racist. It's only like the majority who could be racist. So if you want to define racism that way, then automatically every time you have like the waiter that deals with like customers that might be white and everything goes fine, well, that's one check mark and there's no racism going on. But if there's like a family of color or something and there's some hostility there, then that could only be racism and it can't be something else. And then if you have another customer that or another group of family that's white and there's hostility there and there's mistreatment there, well, that can't be racism, because racism or microaggressions only work against like a minority. So this is the way sometimes science is done. And then what you have at the end, you only have all the hits that and you missed all those interactions between the families that didn't count, because racism only works one way, only goes one way. You can't have those kind of interactions between that go the other way. So like a black person or a person of color can't be racist. So basically what you have, I'm not sure I explained that really well, but it comes down to that you have basically flawed methodology that will always lead to a racist conclusion, and that is extremely problematic. You need you need like something in there that could actually show you, that could distinguish between something that might be racist and something that might be just two people interacting poorly, like one guy's a jerk no matter what color their skin may be, because people are jerks. Everybody's a jerk no matter what color your skin is. But the way that the system is now, there's no way to distinguish that. And that's a real problem within the literature. Not completely, but a lot of studies that come out.
Okay. Nix, I'm going to make to comment to those that have started having a religious discussion in the chat. I respect your questions, although, and I know Dr. Bennett has said he's an atheist. I would prefer that this be more generally about reasoning itself, not any particular position a person takes. I am not myself an atheist. I know I have many followers who are, I have followers of various religious views. I would say the point of this conversation is not more so to try and convince anyone of a particular position. Although admittedly, when I talk, I'm always trying to convince you not to be a Marxist, but but rather knowing how to argue properly. And Dr. Bennett, I think even as an atheist, would you agree there is a difference? Although you reject the existence of God, presumably most theistic arguments are perhaps arguments for the legitimacy of the New Testament Gospels, as that's the kind of discussion I see going on in the chat. I think you would agree there's a difference between a Christian who attempts to make a valid argument in favor of his position and one who makes an invalid argument, whether or not you think the argument succeeds or not.
Well, sure, yeah. I mean, people make good arguments, people make bad arguments. Just one clarification: as an atheist, I just don't believe in any gods. I wouldn't say that no gods exist, and there's a difference, because one's a statement of belief as opposed to a statement of fact.
There's a difference between saying there positively is no God and I do not believe there is a God.
Right, or even saying no God exists, because that's kind of a confident statement about the universe, as opposed to I don't believe in a God because I haven't seen enough evidence for it. I think, and the second one is the position I hold.
Okay. All right. Andrew Ryan says, is the following a valid argument? Premise 1, all human action is purposeful behavior. Premise 2, trying to deny that all human action is purposeful would be acting purposely yourself. And I'll read that one more time. 1, all human action is purposeful behavior. 2, trying to deny that all human action is purposeful would be acting purposefully yourself.
Well, he's missing a conclusion there.
Okay. Did you have more, Mr. Ryan?
Well, I think that second premise could be broken down into a conclusion. So you could take out the conclusion there. So the first one is who's trying to call me here? Sorry about that.
No problem.
The first premise that he's making is kind of like a really strong claim. So I would think that most people would have a problem with that premise, and it would definitely need a lot more support. Like all people act purposefully, and I'm not even sure what that would mean, but I would think that people might have a problem with that. And could you read the second premise again?
It was trying to deny that all human action is purposeful would be acting purposefully.
Would be. Okay, so the second premise might be premise number 2, trying to act as all as purposeful.
In a non-purposeful manner would be. I think he's trying to say that the conclusion is. I'm thinking he's saying his conclusion is all human action is purposeful, because any attempt to do an action in an unpurposeful manner would in fact try to fulfill the purpose of being unpurposeful.
Yeah, I think it's got the makings of a self-defeating argument, or he's trying to point out a self-defeating argument, not his argument in itself. Meaning that if somebody tries to declare that, then they're actually, if they're saying that, they're saying something on purpose. I don't know how good that is. I'd have to think about that one for a little bit.
Okay. And one thing I would say is he asked, is it a valid argument? And I would point out it is entirely possible for an argument to be valid and nonetheless not sound if it's the case that like you pointed out, that first premise, all human action is purposeful. People might have problems with the premise. well, that being said, the argument could still be valid even if one of the premises is false.
Right, and I think this is more. He's trying to make a deductive argument when it's not. It's more of a well, I mean, you have to agree with all the premises in order to make it like a fully a deductive argument, where the conclusion necessarily arrives from the premises. I think that might be tough with that kind of claim, but whatever, you could try.
All right. I guess someone else pointed out it is a logical axiom pointed out by Ludwig von Mises in Human Action, which I've actually read a lot of Mises. I don't recall reading that particular one, but anyways, looks like that was, I mean, a lot of comments here, not as many questions, but it has been about 50 minutes and I try to keep these things from going over an hour because I know that if they're longer than an hour, a lot of people will say, well, that's too long, I'm not going to watch. So anyways, I would say that for me, the reason I feel it's so important to understand logical fallacies and good reasoning is, and I'm sure you've experienced it as well. All of us are going to be in discussions with people who disagree, and we might bring our best arguments, they might bring theirs, and at the end of the day, we're still going to disagree. But there is a difference between being able to say, we've had a discussion, we still disagree, but at least we both did our best to engage in good reasoning, and we can still respect each other's position for trying to do that. Then there's a big difference between that and having a conversation where it devolves into a shouting match where you're just yelling your opinions at each other very loudly, but no one actually walks away having learned anything. So,
Sure.
And that's why I'd say I think it's so important that everyone owes it to themselves, at least try to take the time to study good reasoning and logical fallacies. Yeah. So I'll quick give you a chance to, if anyone else wants to contact you, learn more, what can they do?
You go to logicallyfallacious.com. I think that's, or actually my main website, my personal website is bobennett.com. And then you can see all the things I do there, all the links, different books.
Okay. For those watching, I've already placed a link to Logically Fallacious in the description box. I will place a link to that second website once this is over.
Great. And then, Logically Fallacious is actually a very active community. We have a Q&A tool on there where people ask questions. So we get usually maybe a question a day. Somebody comes in, and then you're welcome to ask questions. You're welcome to join the community and answer the questions. So it's a lot of fun. Just like some people would post things like that last commenter did and say, what do you think about this? Is this a logical fallacy? In which actually I encourage that person to actually do that. Go to logicallyfallacious.com, look for the Q&A. Where does it say that there? Under the menu, questions and answers, and join that community. Post that question there, and not only will I have a kind of like a shot at it after I think about it a little bit more, but a lot of other community members will, and you get a lot of feedback and a lot of ideas. It's a really fun, good community.
No, sounds good. Well, anyways, thank you very much for being on the show.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me.
All right. And to everyone watching, be sure to hit the subscribe button if you haven't. And as always, that is my 2 cents. So take it for what it's worth.